Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at Hezekiah and the Assyrian invasion, 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19. To get an overview of 1st and 2nd Kings, we're in the last section. It began with the United Kingdom of Solomon in chapters 1 through 12 of 1st Kings. Then we had wars of Judah and Israel. There was the ministry of Elijah, Elijah from chapter 17 to 2 Kings chapter 1. The pivotal point in the whole two-book collection was the passing of the prophetic mantle from Elijah to Elisha. Elisha's ministry then is seen in chapters 3 through 13. We have another section of wars of Judah and Israel. And at the end of that, the northern kingdom of Israel is taken into captivity, and that leaves us with the remaining section. We're entering into that now, and that will be the kingdom of Judah all by itself. Chapter 18, verse 1, Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king. Ahaz, remember, had not been a good king. He had been not just worshiping God in the right way, he had been worshiping other gods, and whatever came along, he would give a try. And Hezekiah is going to be the polar opposite. Hezekiah is going to be an excellent king following the Lord. We see this in verse 3. He did right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father David had done. He removed the high places and broke down the sacred pillars and cut down the Asherah. He also broke in pieces the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Now, we haven't even heard a word about the bronze serpent that Moses had made. Remember, that was way back in the book of Numbers when the Israelites had been in the wilderness and they had been complaining against God, and God had sent poisonous serpents into the camp to bite them, and people were they were getting bitten by these poisonous snakes, and they were dying. And God gave Moses a means of deliverance. He said, take some bronze and fashion a bronze serpent, put it up on a pole, and whoever comes and looks at this bronze serpent will be saved. And of course, it's a beautiful picture of Jesus. And so there wasn't anything wrong with the bronze serpent. There wasn't anything wrong with the healing that it brought or the picture that it represented of Jesus. But notice what had happened. For until those days, the sons of Israel burned incense to it, and it was called Nehushtan. And so this Nehushtan had become, instead of being a sign of the eventual coming of Messiah, instead of that, it had become an object of worship and of idolatry. And this shows how you can even take a good thing, something that is supposed to point to Jesus, and turn it for evil. And that's what had taken place. And so Hezekiah takes this bronze serpent and breaks it up, breaks it in pieces so that it no longer will be an icon of worship. Verse 5, he trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, so that after him there was none like him among all the kings of Judah, nor among those who were before him. Hezekiah is going to bring faithfulness to an entirely new level. And so he's trusting in the Lord, and he will become renowned as the king who brings Israel and Judah in particular. But notice he trusted in the God of Israel, and we're going to hear that language of Israel and Judah. Even though Israel has been taken away captivity, he's going to turn the hearts of the people back to the Lord. Verse 6, for he clung to the Lord, he did not depart from following him, but kept his commandments, which the Lord had commanded Moses. And the Lord was with him wherever he prospered, and he rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. Now, everything up to this point has been, oh, that's great, that's great, that's great. And all of a sudden you read the last part of verse 7, he rebelled against the king of Assyria, and you want to say, uh-oh, I see problems. Now, he begins to make some preparations. We haven't talked about yet who the Assyrians are, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But let's first look at the preparations that he makes. First of all, he extends the walls of Jerusalem, and you can actually go to Jerusalem and see some of Hezekiah's extensions of the walls of Jerusalem that he makes. And also, he he sets up to guard the water supply of Jerusalem because the city of Jerusalem has a natural spring called the Gihon Spring. But the problem with the spring is that located outside the walls of the city, and it's at the bottom of this very steep ravine. Well, how is he going to guard a water supply that's outside the city? And the answer is he's going to block it up so that it will be diverted, and then he will cut a channel. Now it's at the bottom of a steep ridge, and the city itself, Old Jerusalem, was located on top of that ridge. So how do you divert water? Water doesn't flow uphill. His answer was to build a tunnel, to cut a tunnel through the mountain so that the water could be diverted, and it would flow downhill, but through this tunnel. Now we read about this construction project not here in Second Kings, but in Second Chronicles. So we don't usually turn over to Second Chronicles, so I'm going to do that here. Chapter 32 and verse 30, it says that it was Hezekiah who stopped the upper outlet of the waters of Gihon, the Gihon spring, and directed them to the west side of the city of David. And you can go today to Jerusalem and go through this tunnel. It's a very long tunnel, takes you through from one side to the other. This is sort of a drawing / map, and you see along the bottom, you can see it looks like a squiggly line in blue that runs underneath the city, and sort of a cutaway of the city, because like I said, water won't flow downhill, so they had to cut the tunnel where it is sloping downward, and it redirects that water all the way to the bottom of the ridge, but it's inside the walls, to redirect that water so that it will remain inside the city. When I was there, and I took this picture in 2007, when you got to the end of the tunnel, there was a carved out opening, which my guide there is standing next to. This carved area is cut away. And what they had done, back in the 1800s, they discovered an inscription written in Old Hebrew, Old Hebrew script, and it tells the story from the workers' point of view, how they cut this tunnel. There were two different teams, one coming from the south, the other coming from the north, and they met sort of halfway. Now the inscription itself is right toward the southern end of the tunnel, and if you go there today, go to the tunnel today, they have made a replica of that inscription, and you can see it mounted. So there's not a hole there anymore. Now they filled the hole with this replica, and you can see that at least a copy of that inscription at the end of the tunnel. Of course, you have to be able to read Hebrew to read the inscription. And it tells the story from the worker's point of view of how this tunnel was dug in the days of Hezekiah. Now, why are they making all these preparations? Because of the Assyrians, and the Assyrians are on their way to Judah, and we have to talk just a bit now about the Assyrians, their culture, their conflicts, and that for which they've made themselves known. The Assyrians were the major superpower of the Middle East in that day. They were known for their major siege machines, and what you see here, these drawings are actually taken from one of the Assyrian palaces. So they would decorate their palaces with siege warfare. Their military was mobilized into all sorts of different contingents. You had the common soldier. Here you have the slingers. You also have their chariot corps. The chariots both, and they could be used both for, um, ceremonies and parades, but also these were used in military battles as well. The Assyrians had also picked up the idea not just of having their horses pull chariots, but also the idea of riding horses. Now, they seem to have borrowed that, I think, from the Scythians who lived to their north. The Scythians were a nomadic horse riding people. And so here in this drawing, you see an Assyrian he's an Assyrian archer riding on horseback, where they would ride up, shoot the arrows, turn around, and ride away. Now they're not using lances or things like that, that you're going to see with the later knights, because notice there's something missing from this horseback rider. He doesn't have stirrups. That had not been invented yet. And so the archers would be sort of a light mobile infantry, where they could run up, shoot, and then quickly ride away before they would be engaged. As I said, the Assyrians had mastered the art of siege warfare, and in this wall inscription, in this wall engraving, you can see the defenders trying to hold up against the Assyrians, who were breaking through the wall, breaking it down, and they were masters at this. They would bring up their big siege machines, knocking down the enemy walls and breaking through, so that a city, even with mighty walls, was not safe from the Assyrians. Here you see a picture of their prisoners, because once they captured the city, they would, if there were any survivors at all, and being a survivor was a wonder in itself, but if a city was captured and there were those that were allowed to survive, they would be transported away, relocated to another part of the world, so that there would be no city here with those same inhabitants that were left. Here you see a picture of captives being sent away from, and notice whatever they're allowed to carry for the day, because the Assyrians aren't going to feed them. You have to leave. You have to go to this far off land and resettle and begin living in those places. The Assyrians had also become known for their torture methods. They delighted in new forms of torture. Now it was a cruel world anyway. They had invented a form of crucifixion and impalement. Notice the heads that are gathered. These are Assyrians that have gathered. Here in this picture, they've staked their captives down upon the ground, tying them up as they prepare to play one of their games, where they would see who could, and they would actually have competitions, who could strip off the most skin from their screaming victim, and yet still leave him screaming and alive. Here in this picture, we see them cutting off the legs and arms of their victim. Notice the center picture, there's a man being impaled. You can see where the stake is going to some, some parts of the person, very painful section. And then on the right side, notice it looks like a building. That's actually a stylized city. And all around the city, there are heads that are mounted from their victims, from their captives, as they have cut the heads off, and for those that are still alive, they're cutting off their feet and arms and any sort of torture, so that you would be terrified to face the Assyrians. Notice in this picture, you have the Assyrian victors, each coming with a head in each hand. They are showing the ones that they have conquered. And it was considered, just the idea of the Assyrians would strike fear and terror into their enemies. This is the situation in which our passage opens up now, as we come to chapter 18, verse 13. Now, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and seized them. And in short order, he has captured a great many cities within the country of Judah. Verse 14, then Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent to the king of Assyria at Lachish, saying, I have done wrong. Withdraw from me. Whatever you impose on me, I will bear. Notice what he's saying. Basically, I give up. I will pay, not only what I owed you with regard to the tribute, I'll pay penalty fees, I'll pay whatever it takes. So the king of Assyria required of Hezekiah, king of Judah, 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. That was probably the entire gross national product for the entire country. Verse 15, Hezekiah gave him all the silver which was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house. Hezekiah had to empty out his treasury, and he had to empty out the treasury of the temple in order to pay off this extortion. Verse 16, at that time Hezekiah cut off the gold from the doors of the temple of the Lord and from the doorposts which Hezekiah king of Judah had overlaid, and gave it to the king of Assyria. He's having to strip the temple bare to pay this exorbitant price. Then the king of Assyria sent Tartan and Rabsaris and Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah with a large army to Jerusalem. He has paid him off, and instead of satisfying him, the king of Assyria says, now we're going to come and take your city, and we're going to kill you. So they went up and came to Jerusalem, and when they went up, they came and stood by the conduit of the upper pool, which is on the highway of the fuller's field. So they're right outside Jerusalem by the waterworks supplying water. Of course, they remember Jerusalem has its interior water, but this is other waterworks. And they've come from Lachish, which is Sennacherib's headquarters, and made their way up to Jerusalem because almost all the other cities have already been taken, including Lachish. That's actually falling as we speak to the Assyrians. Verse 19, then Rabshakeh said to them, say now to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, what is this confidence that you have? You say, but they're only empty words, I have counsel and strength for the war. Now on whom do you rely that you've rebelled against me? Now behold, do you rely on the staff of this crushed reed, even on Egypt? And just so you know what's happened, there's a pharaoh in Egypt that had trying to been build up support against the Assyrians. And maybe that had been the reason for Hezekiah to rebel, listening to Egypt versus listening to the Assyrians. But that's not going to pan out. Notice, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. If you're trusting on Egypt to save you, you're actually going to get injured by trusting in Egypt. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who rely on him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, and this is what Hezekiah should have been doing, hopefully is doing. If we trust in the Lord our God, notice the Lord is in all capital letters, which means this is Yahweh that he's referring to. Is it not he whose high places and whose altars Hezekiah has taken away, and has said to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? Now here, the Rabshakeh is showing his theological ignorance. He's thinking that by Hezekiah taking down all the high places, that would have offended Yahweh. In reality, that's the very thing that brought Yahweh's support and Yahweh's accolades and his approval. So sometimes bad theology just shows up, and it does right here. Verse 25, have I now come up without the Lord's approval against this place to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it. And so the Rabshakeh, and he's just a spokesman, the king of Assyria is saying, Yahweh sent me to destroy the kingdom of Judah. Now, frankly, I think he's lying through his teeth. Whenever you hear somebody says, God told me to do this, take a double look. Maybe they're the ones that are just making it up, as is the case here. Verse 26, then Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, and Shebna and Joah, these are the religious leaders, said to Rabshakeh, speak now to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it, and do not speak with us in Judean in the hearing of the people who are on the wall. Judean, that's just going to be another word for Hebrew. Aramaic is a related language, but frankly, it is a different language. So they're close, they're very close, but they're not identical. And Aramaic is the common language all throughout the Middle East. But notice Rabshakeh is actually speaking in the dialect that the Jews on the wall would all hear and understand. Verse 27, but Rabshakeh said to them, has my master sent me only to your master and to you to speak these words, and not to the men who sit on the wall, doomed to eat their own dung and drink their own urine with you? In other words, we've surrounded the city. There's going to be no food going in, no food going out. And what you have to eat is what comes out of your own body. That's all you have. So very, very harsh words. And he's wanting to say this as a propaganda piece against all the Jews that are in earshot, hoping that they will rebel. He's trying to foment a rebellion against Hezekiah within his own city. Then Rabshakeh stood and cried with a loud voice in Judean, in other words, in Hebrew, saying, "Hear the word of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you from my hand, nor let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me and eat each of his vine and each of his fig tree." When you hear about eating of someone's vine, eating of someone's fig tree, that's sometimes in Old English we'll say a chicken in every pot, and I'm not sure what the rest of the saying is. It's a figure of speech that describes when everything is glowing and wonderful, and everybody has a lot, and the stock market is up. Um, Eating each of his vine, each of his fig tree, and notice he says, and drink each of the waters of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards, a land of olive trees and honey, that you may live and not die. In other words, you're going to get deported. That's just going to happen. Now you can get deported and live through it and go to a nice land that I prepared you, or you can wait for me to break in and I will just kill and chop off heads and arms and fingers. And but if you want to survive, you need to surrender now. But do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you, saying, "The Lord will deliver us." And now he asks what I think is a key question: has any one of the gods of the nations delivered his land from the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim, Hena and Eva? Have they delivered Samaria from my hand? Who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their land from my hand, that the Lord, that Yahweh, should deliver Jerusalem from my hand? Yeah, what makes you think that your God is so much greater than all of these other gods from all of these other nations, and their gods have failed them, and your God is going to fail you as well? Verse 36, but the people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, do not answer him. Don't get into this conversation. By the way, a good that's good advice on sometimes when you're attacked by Satan, by the enemy. Don't go don't go having a battle of words with him. Don't enter into an argument. Rather, don't listen to him at all. Silence. It reminds me a bit of there was an old movie. I don't even remember the name of it, where the I, the main character was being tempted to enter into an adulterous relationship, and instead of just saying no, he goes in the bathroom and he's looking in a mirror and he's sort of arguing with himself and giving him the pros and the cons. And you can see he's being tempted. Now the good news is he resists the temptation, but the bad news, he's sitting there arguing. And it's sometimes you need to not argue with temptation. Just say, and somebody actually made this a quip, just say no. Now we come to chapter 19, beginning in chapter 19. We're halfway through the story. The charge has been made. Jerusalem is surrounded. And now, chapter 19, verse 1, when Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and entered the house of the Lord. Hezekiah goes to the temple. He goes into the presence of God, not into the Holy of Holies, but still into the temple. And so we get to verse 5. The servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, and Isaiah said to them, thus you shall say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you've heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me, and what they had said was blasphemy. Behold, I will put a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. God says, I'm going to give you the victory, and I will do it in such a way you're not going to have to lift a sword. You're not going to have to fight a battle. You're not going to have to do anything. You just wait and trust in me, and I will accomplish this. And so the Assyrian campaign, it started, as we said, Sennacherib's initial headquarters were in Lachish. A bit later, he moves to Libnah. And you say, well, how do I know that? We know that both from the biblical texts, where we're going to see this described, but also we have Sennacherib's own writing on this. And we're going to look in a minute at what he has to say about the battle. News now comes that the Cushite pharaoh, the pharaoh from Egypt, but actually this is the 25th dynasty of Egypt, where some of these pharaohs are actually from the lands to the south of Egypt, from what they call the land of Cush, and his name was Tirhakah, was coming against the Assyrians, mentioned here in chapter 19, verse 9. And Rabshakeh responds with a second round of propaganda coming up against you've heard that this pharaoh was coming. It's all going to come to naught. You need to surrender. And again, there is more propaganda that we see. Verse 14, the propaganda this time comes in the form of a letter, and Hezekiah takes the letter from the hand of the messengers and reads it. And now he went up to the house of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. He brings this message. And we're not going to go into all the detail, but he brings it before the presence of God and lays it out and says, Lord, do you see what they're saying? Verse 20, then Isaiah the son of Amos sent to Hezekiah, saying, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me about Sennacherib, king of Assyria, I heard you. Isn't it great when God hears us? We get to verse 30, and God is saying, the surviving remnant of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem will go forth a remnant. That's all that's left. Remember, Sennacherib has come and captured city after city after city. But there's a remnant. And from this house will go forth a remnant. And out of Mount Zion, survivors. The zeal of the Lord will perform this. God is concerned about his plan, about his people, about his city. And he is going, even though the city has been diminished, he's going to do something wonderful that will eventually not just fill up Judah, but will eventually fill up the entire world. Verse 32, therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to the city or shoot an arrow there, and he will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. And remember, those are things that he'd already done against Lachish, against other cities. Verse 33, by the way that he came, by the same he will return, and he shall not come to the city, declares the Lord, for I will defend the city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake. And so the conclusion comes in verse 35. Then it happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived in Nineveh. Now, it's interesting that the Greek historian Herodotus, who lives, frankly, quite a few, a couple of hundred years later, so he is later, about 100 years later, but he writes of this battle and how the Assyrians came against the Jews. And he says, and then they turned around and left because of something that had happened supernaturally. Now, he doesn't mention 185,000 of the Assyrians dying. What he says, the way, and the story had probably changed a few times by the way it comes to him, but he says that suddenly a invasion of mice swept into the Assyrian camp, and they ate up all the bowstrings and all of the straps that held the shields and weapons in place, and they ate all those things. And the Assyrians got up in the morning, and all of their bowstrings had been eaten, and all the weapons, they weren't bound together. Everything that held them together just fell apart. And the king said, "Okay, I'm done," and packed up and went home. And so we have one Greek story written much after the fact. It doesn't mention the 185,000, but mentions how the Assyrians suddenly quit and went home because of something that had happened supernatural. The passage here says 185,000 suddenly died. But we also have what is called the Taylor prism. And it is a sort of a fun, gee, how many sides is that? I guess that's a six-sided um, piece of stone with writing on all six straight sides. That's why it's called a prism. And it lists Sennacherib's own version of what took place in this campaign, about how, and throughout it you're reading about how he came to this country and he killed the king and tore his head off and cut off his arms and legs and put his head on the city gate, and then he came to the next city and he gouged out all the eyes of the people and cut off their arms and legs and stripped their skin off, and it goes on like this for paragraph after paragraph until you come to Hezekiah. As for Hezekiah the Jew, he says, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by escalade and bringing up siege engines. In other words, he had conquered a number of cities. We know this both from the biblical text and also from archaeology. But then when he gets down to Hezekiah, and you're expecting to read, and he took off his head and destroyed the city and cut off all the arms, but instead he says himself, Hezekiah, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. In other words, he gets down to Hezekiah and he says, and Hezekiah, I surrounded him, which is, you say, well, why didn't you go on? Why didn't you capture the city? Why didn't you kill Hezekiah? And he makes no mention of losing 185,000 Assyrians, 185,000 soldiers. Why is that? That's because the Assyrians never talked about their defeats. They never admitted to a defeat. And that is not merely an ancient phenomena. Back during the Gulf War, I can vividly remember where we had the news crews that were embedded in with both the American and United Nations soldiers, but also in Iraq, which was that's just the modern name for what used to be Assyria. And they were there in Iraq, and they were filming live on the streets of Baghdad as the minister of propaganda, whatever his title was standing on the street giving a live interview, and he stands up there and he says, "Yes, we have won the war. All the Americans died in the desert, and we have been victorious." Really? Yes, yes. And all of a sudden you hear it in the background, somebody say, "Hey, look at that." And suddenly the camera just swung to the right. And like I said, this was live TV. We were watching a live news. And it swung to the right, and in comes, you can see American tanks rolling into the city. And then they come back to the minister of propaganda. He says, "Don't look at that over there. I'm telling you, they all died in the desert," because they never admitted their own defeats back then, or frankly, even today. Now, verse 37, it came about, this is our old friend Sennacherib, the Assyrian king. He goes back home, and it came about as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Sharezer killed him with a sword. These are actually two of his sons who murder him, who assassinate him. And they escaped into the land of Ararat, what they call back then Urartu. This is to the north of Assyria, a place where Noah landed with the ark. And Esarhaddon, his son, this was another son, became king in his place. And so the word of the Lord was fulfilled, both in delivering Jerusalem and Hezekiah, and in also putting an end to this king who had blasphemed the name of God. I love how God protects his name. He does that even today. And so you be careful about speaking against the Lord.